After long trials and tribulations, Mage is finally getting some love. Mage? Do you mean Fire Mage? Yes. And also Frost Mage. And also Arcane Mage. They have been announcing that Mage is due for a rework. Now, we don't know exactly what. We do have a couple of details, but the devs have been hearing people about all of the Mage changes and what they would need. And I don't know if all of them will be listened to in the end, but it's definitely looking good. And Mage definitely is looking over some new horizons in the near future. It's basically going to happen in the 10.1.5 patch Fractures in Time. That's when the Mage is going to get a rework for all 3 specs. Now, let's see exactly what the devs have in mind for all this. And also, don't forget, if you like the type of content that we do, consider checking our Patreon page as well. It supports the channel. It helps us make more and more of these videos. And it goes a long way into growing the channel also. And hey, you might get some goodies of your own, depending on the tier that you want to, support us with. We super humbly appreciate and are grateful for all of your support. Now, since we don't have exactly all of the details of what they want to do for the Mage, we can only take their blue post and their thoughts on how the spec is supposed to be into consideration and kind of try to figure out exactly if this is going to be what Mage really needed. So to kind of quote what they've mentioned so far is that the current Mage class tree has a variety of talents which offer a variety of utility and survivability options. But with its current layout, a lot of those choices feel difficult to navigate. This is due to the nature of their current capstones and how impactful and important they are to the overall rotation for each of the specs. In Fractures in Time, we're making a few changes such as making some abilities baseline, yes, removing Rune of Power, wait, what? A slightly new tree layout and adding 3 new capstone abilities to replace Shifting Power and Meteor. We'll highlight some of these larger changes below. So let's first take a look at the Rune of Power changes. They're essentially removing Rune of Power from the class tree and shifting some of its lost power directly into all mage abilities that deal damage. While the decision to remove Rune of Power wasn't easy, we feel it is best for the long-term health of the class. Fighting within a Rune of Power is almost mandatory to maximize your damage as a mage, and any sort of mechanic that forces you out of it for a prolonged period of time ends up feeling incredibly punishing to your overall throughput. No kidding! In Raid, Mythic Plus, and PvP, having a player commit to a small space for 12 seconds is a large ask, and one that just doesn't feel fun to play around, as frequent as Rune of Power is. By removing Rune of Power, we are able to shift more of the mage's damage into their abilities baseline, while also leaving us room to further amplify their big cooldowns, Arcane Surge, Combustion, and Icy Veins if necessary. While we expect it to be a large adjustment at first, we're confident that this will be an overall boom for mages in the future. This is definitely maybe one of the most asked for changes that mages have been getting. And if you've played any amount of Caster and any amount of content in Season 1, you will know that more than any time in the past, it seems like casters have been punished severely by doing or not doing mechanics, by having to hardcast or not having to hardcast as much anymore. The amount of swirlies that you have to dodge, the amount of kicks and silences that are going on in the dungeons as well, the amount of travel time from one part of the other, all of these dungeons, all these mechanics just make casting incredibly difficult while they are happening, not to mention, add on top of this, the fact that you have to stay within the Rune of Power circle is just way too punishing. The game definitely seems to be moving into a direction where you have more and more mechanics that force you to be aware of the encounter and how you're moving, and essentially moving away from situations where you have to hard cast. Now, this is great that this is happening, and maybe this is the future of casters where we rely less and less on hard casting abilities or staying in one place for a prolonged time. Now, obviously, this starts with Rune of Power, but we can only hope that this goes on further and further into the future. Now, talking about the actual talent tree, let's see what exactly their thoughts on it is. While the overall structure of the class tree has changed, we've made a few key adjustments that should allow for a little more customization when speccing into your class tree. The total number of capstones has been reduced from 5 to 3. At the moment, mages' capstones have a wide variety of power that offer different levels of throughput or survivability and utility. The difference in damage, throughput, and utility/survivability at the capstone level has proven to be somewhat problematic for mage and their ability to feel free to customize their tree as they see fit. True. The tree is now structured to offer 3 capstones, with the center capstone, Time Anomalies and Temporal Warp, offering the only throughput, and the left and right capstones offering different utilities or survivability, for you to consider based on the content you might be running. The goal here is the new structure is to offer a little more flexibility within the class tree and feeling less mandatory to pick up both Shifting Power and Time Anomaly Temporal Warp choice node. This is also live that we can see right now. So right now the capstones are slightly changed, and I do agree from a concept perspective, having to choose between throughput and utility has proven incredibly difficult for all of the specs so far, and we have seen changes in their design for other specs. Shadow Priest, for instance, has gotten silence and its main defensive a little bit more accessible, where you don't really have a choice to go over it. Balanced Druid as well has seen its silence/kick not be a choice between it and more damage, because this is always going to be problematic when you are a DPS. You will want to maximize your damage output, and having to sacrifice that for survivability when nobody else has to do that feels very bad. So right now we have a couple of capsules to look at. However, keep in mind that these will probably change. We've seen iterations on the reworks, things change, talents moved around. We know this from the red rework, so it's not set in stone. First of all, Ice Cold is at the bottom left side of the tree, and maybe it's one of the more interesting ones. What this does is makes Ice Block now reduce all damage taken by 70% for 6 seconds, but no longer grants immunity, prevents movement, attacks, or casting spells, and does not incur the global cooldown. This is really interesting. Obviously, one of the reasons why you would want a mage, let's say in a raid scenario, over its damage would be the fact that you can immune certain mechanics. It has been something that mages have been doing for a very long time, and that is really cool, but you don't really need it all the time. Not to mention that when you do have to immune a mechanic, you don't get to do anything else. So this comes to change that for now. It gives you a 70% wall. 70% damage reduction is massive. I dare say, I think it's the only one in the game that's this high. Not even tanks have this much damage reduction for 6 seconds. It's very hard to figure out how you're going to die with a 70% damage reduction ability on you. Not to mention, you can just do everything else. So on a situation where you don't need to immune a certain mechanic, you can actually still opt to take this and not have to die or be forced to not be able to do anything while your Ice Block lasts. And speaking of the Shifting Power talent, you will see now that the Shifting Power has been moved really far up the talent tree, and you will see a bunch of other changes. Now, once again, these changes might not be final, so we're only going to cover the main ones so far. You will see that Incanter's Flow has replaced Invisibility, whereas before it was a choice node with Rune of Power, where now Shifting Power is. And all the way to the bottom of the talent tree, the new capstones, well, you know, the new choice capstones on the right will be between Mass Barrier, which is a 2-minute cooldown that once pressed, you get Prismatic, Blazing, and Ice Barriers all on you and 3 nearby allies at the same time. This is really interesting. Definitely a cool thing to bring to your group, where you can just press and absorb. And depending on how all of this scales, I mean, Barrier for Mage is a decent amount of absorb and slight sustain. It's not particularly amazing, but we do know from Shadowlands, where this was a legendary, I believe, at one point where pressing 1 barrier gave you all 3. This was one of the things that made mages incredibly tanky. Obviously, this was mostly a PvP legendary from what I can remember. However, used in PvE on a 2-minute cooldown, this is essentially another defensive ability. Now, since we haven't made mage in a while, I'm not sure exactly how much defensive power this is, but it definitely sounds pretty crazy. And couple this with Ice Cold, if there will be a world where you will want to pick both of these at the same time while also getting likely the middle capstone, you can essentially bring a lot of tankiness to your group. Or what the devs more likely will expect you to do is choose between which of these you will end up going for. You can go the right-hand side, the Dragon's Breath into, let's say, Mass Barrier, I don't know, route, and just get the defensiveness that way, or take Ice Cold on the other side. Now, you also have Mass Invisibility, which I'm not sure if this was an ability that mages had in the past. It definitely sounds something like mage would do, but it definitely is a little bit more roguey because it sounds like Shroud. Now, Mass Invisibility is a 5-minute cooldown, and you and your allies within 40 yards instantly become invisible for 10 seconds. Taking any action will cancel this effect. So this is pretty much the mage invisibility mechanic. Now, obviously, this has some interesting applications, depending on how the game will still see invisibility as a mechanic. If it works the same as your normal invisibility, where you can press it, it has 2 seconds charge time, and then you can drop combat together. Although, I do have to mention that this sounds like it's going to be instant right now, which I guess gives mages the Shroud ability that rogues would have. Now, whether or not mobs are more prone to see invisibility or not, since invisibility used to be stronger than stealth, remains to be seen, because if this is what we expect it to be, a little bit stronger than stealth, then this could mean really cool things for Mythic Plus, where you can do certain skips that maybe only a mage can help you with, which, I mean, it's great. Listen, mages already have a lot of reasons to be invited to a group, but hey, here's another one. And this is just with the general talent tree. There are a lot more talents moved around, and I expect a lot more to be addressed and moved around, so we will wait to see what the final iteration of the Mage rework is before we make like a final video on what it would be like. But this is not everything that has changed. Obviously, the 3 specs have gotten some changes as well. Starting with Arcane Mage, which is one of the specs that has been really changing over the years. Their essential thoughts on is that going into Fractures in Time, we want to focus on giving Arcane Mage a more consistent way to deal AoE damage without having to rely on Touch of the Magi or Radiant Spark windows where quick mob deaths or movement can greatly hinder their performance. Arcane also has a few talents that offer a variety of utility but felt inaccessible based on their position on the tree, pathing in the tree, or lack of points after filling out their chosen builds. To combat this, we've shifted a few things baseline, most notably Arcane Barrage and Clear Casting, and updated the pathing on a few talents. Now, this is of course particularly great because we've seen this style of design and reworks on all of the DPS specs so far, where pathing has been improved. We know a lot of this has been done for Druid, obviously for Paladin as well, but you will notice some really big changes so far. First of all, where you would start with Arcane Barrage, now Arcane Missiles becomes the ideal, really quick accessible ability, essentially making Arcane Barrage baseline. That's great. I mean, you know, you're never not gonna use Arcane Barrage, but at the same time, you're never not gonna use Arcane Missiles anyway, so I guess it's just a choice between the two. So what is exactly changing for Arcane AoE, outside of the obvious talent path changing and some positionings moved around? First of all, what they're essentially saying is that we've reworked Orb Barrage Capstone talent into something a little bit more consistent and likely familiar to Legion Arcane players. Orb Barrage now gives your Arcane Barrage a chance per Arcane charge spent to hurl an Arcane Orb at your target. This talent should give a much needed way to both sending out some consistent AoE damage while also giving a steady stream of Arcane charge generation when fighting large packs. We've also added a new talent, Concentrated Power, which gives more purpose to your clear casting and Arcane Explosion while in AoE fights. This talent causes your Arcane Explosion to echo an additional time for a percentage of its original damage. And right now, this talent is very close to the very top of the tree. It actually goes down from Arcane Missiles, and what it does, bar any other changes that might happen, makes it so that when you consume a clear casting effect, your next Arcane Missile channel 20% faster, or your Arcane Explosion echoes for 40% additional damage. Likely the percentages will be changed if balance so dictates, but this is really cool because this definitely offers you some flexibility into picking a talent that can work both in single target and both in AoE, and we have seen other specs make this style of change into success, because otherwise you would just be forced to pick dead talents that wouldn't work any other way, since right now in WoW we don't really have content that's exclusively just AoE or exclusively just single target, except for a couple of raid boss fights where you can just have only single target. But for instance, dungeons where you would probably want more AoE than anywhere else, you still need boss damage to be able to clear the dungeon, and having to choose between hard AoE or hard single target has never been really good for any spec so far, so I'm glad we're seeing stuff like this. And in terms of the actual positioning and pathing, although still probably not final, their thoughts are as follows. We've also updated Arcane Street to be a little bit more flexible when trying to pick up unique nodes that aren't always directly throughput. We've shifted Arcane Barrage and Clear Casting baseline, untied Reverberate from Nether Tempest, added new connections from Nether Tempest, and removed the Arcane Power talent and folded its power into Arcane Surge. The goal with these changes is to give you a couple of extra points to play with and create a more positive experience as you navigate through the tree, enabling you to create a spec tree that fits your needs. Very awesome. I'm glad that they're taking this mentality to Arcane as well, and hopefully it applies to more specs in the future. Speaking of, Fire and Frost haven't gotten that many changes just yet, but they are due for a couple of things. Their essentially thoughts is that while this round of Fractures in Time PTR, aka there are going to be more rounds of Fractures in Time PTR, the 10.1.5 patch, while this one only includes class and arcane updates, aside from the damage redistribution from the Rune of Power change, we have not forgotten about Fire or Frost. Well, great, because likely those are more popular, right? we have plans for them in upcoming PTR builds. Now, what exactly will happen? Well, first of all, for Fire, at the moment, suffers from a one-build-fits-all talent tree. Oh, don't we know it? Which is problematic for a couple of reasons. The lack of choice and variety gets stale after a while, yes. Ignite dealing large portions of your damage in single target and AoE makes it incredibly difficult for us to separately tune single target or AoE damage for Fire during tuning phases. I feel like we've been here before. Moving forward, we want to explore ways where we can create alternative AoE builds that aren't just Ignite stacking, reduce the amount of 2.0s to free up a few points, yes! And shift some abilities baseline such as Flame Strike and Cauterize. Oh, yes. These aren't final or comprehensive changes, but hopefully give a good idea of our goals for Fire moving forward. I am definitely a big fan of this because Ignite damage profiles have been fun, let's say. I mean, it has been one of the best mage playstyles in the recent expansion, especially in 8.3 Nyalotha patch, where Fire Mage was pretty much doing all of its damage during Ignite. And because of the similar style of design moving into Dragonflight, you have probably never talented into Flame Strike or any of the other actually cool talents that have been using Flame Strike as a filler or as a source or anything that as a core. Which is great to see that they're doing this. Now, I don't know exactly what this will be like. I would imagine something akin to Ignite maybe being a single target stuff. Maybe it's doing reduced damage on the second and third target and so on, where you would be incentivized to use Flame Strike. And the fact that it is baseline makes it particularly good, especially Cauterize. I know Cauterize has been a controversial thing, starting with Dragonflight, especially in the beta as well, where people would be able to skip Cauterize and maybe incentivized to do so if they had damage. So making all of this stuff baseline just makes it better. And this is Fire, but what about Frost? Well, first of all, their initial thoughts on Frost is that moving forward with Frost, we're looking into lesser picked talents that offer a different gameplay style compared to the meta builds but generally underperform. Talents like Ray of Frost and Glacial Spike offer unique alternatives to the standard rotation, but given their current impact and lack of synergy within the tree, they become a hard thing to opt into. Additionally, we're taking a look into the minimal Ice Lance builds, as this shouldn't be the correct way to play Frost. Ice Lance should be an impactful button that is played around rather than minimally cast due to the amount of modifiers of other talents and damage sources preventing it from being so. There are also some talents we want to reassess in the talent tree and instead move baselines such as Blizzard and Cold Snap. Lastly, due to the amount of talents required to make Icy Veins feel like a high impact cooldown is relatively high, we would like to take this opportunity to see if we can make it stand on its own a little more. This is particularly great because, as we've seen during the first season of Dragonflight, Frost has pretty much been also slightly a cookie cutter build, just like Fire, where you just sink in all of your points into the Icy Veins builds. And this, I mean, this is great that this could be a playstyle, but obviously it was overperforming everything else. And personally, being a fan of Glacial Spike makes it feel a little bit boring for me to play Frost, where I'm just, you know, playing the same old thing that was actually also really good in Shadowlands. So it's good that they're taking this into consideration. Likely we're going to see a reduced amount of Icy Veins nodes. Maybe some of them will be baked in together. Maybe some of them will be made baseline. Although I cannot see them being made baseline without actually making Icy Veins baseline. So we will have to see. This is likely the first look of the rework for Mage as a whole, considering that they definitely want to cover all three specs in the 10.1.5 patch, and we've only seen Arcane. And of course, just to calm everybody down, okay, this will probably not be final. Remember that when Red got reworked, there were a lot of things that were put into the game that didn't make it into the live rework, and a bunch of them also changed, likely more of them being changed in the future as well. So this is a really good way to just kind of get a glimpse of what their thoughts on the Mage is, what they want it to be, so we can kind of have some proper expectations. Well, judging from the feedback that mages have been getting all throughout Dragonflight so far, it's pretty positive. And looking at the comment section in the forum post where they've essentially announced these changes, it's really positive, man. Like, people are overjoyed with all of the changes. And even though we don't main mage anymore, it's lovely to see that it's pretty much universally accepted, since reworks are usually, you know, a hit and miss, as it was with Shadow Priest, for instance, and not everybody loved it. But so far, everybody's up in arms like, yeah, finally, we're getting back to mages. No more Rune of Power. Yes, some talent options. Yes, make rotations feel more engaging, and maybe we can move around from cookie cutter builds and just bland stuff that we've been playing with for ages. So it's really good that Mages is going into this direction. What do you think? Is this enough to spike your interest? Are you waiting for more specific changes? What exactly do you want to see in the Mage rework? Let us know in the comment section below, because we know that devs are watching this video. Thank you for supporting the video. Thank you, Patreons, for always being on our corner, in our side, supporting our content. And we will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classical retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.